Let's think about how decimals relate to fractions and percentages. Let's just start with decimals and fractions. So I've got some decimals here. I'm going to look at each one in turn and we'll see how we can make them into a fraction. It's quite simple. So for 0.1, if I think about what that number is, I can look at the place value and I can see that it is no units but one, whatever one of those is. See if you can tell me what that would be. So that would be a tenth. So tenth, not a 10, a tenth. So if that is 1/10, I've automatically got a fraction, 1/10. And it works the same way with this one. If I was to put my place value headings here, I see that what I've got in 0.01 is 1/100th. Place value really helps us here, and it's nice and simple. Once I know those facts, it can help me with others. So if I know that 0.1 is the same as 1/10, then I can look at this and see that in this example, 0.2, I've got 2/10, which I would write as 2/10. Or, in this case, I've got 0.09, and I've got 9/100ths, like I just had 1/100th here, and I can write it as a fraction like that. So that's one way to get between decimals and fractions. It's really nice and simple. There are others that you might just know. We'll come to those a little bit later. Let's look at how it can also link to percentages. So percentage means for every 100. Cent is 100. So if I have 100 square like this and I have 3 of them coloured in, I've got 3 out of my 100 squares coloured in. You might like to look back at the fractions video to think about how the 100 is how many parts we have, our denominator, and our numerator is 3, what we have coloured in. So here I've got 3 out of my 100 coloured in. So you could probably think to yourself, what would that be if I was thinking of a decimal? We've just seen a minute ago that when I think of a decimal in terms of my place value, I can think of it as 3/100ths, like this, 3 in my hundredths column with nothing else. So there I've got 0.03. So far, if this was my whole object, then the bit coloured in would be 3/100ths or 0.03 of the whole thing. What about a percentage then? Well, if it's 3 out of the 100, then that is very simply 3%. Let's look at another example, and you might be able to see some links. So in this example, instead of just having 3 out of 100 coloured in, I've now got 33 out of my 100 coloured in. So just like before, I can then write it down using my place value. So if I write down my place value, units, tenths and hundredths, then this time I still have no units, and I can say this in either two ways. I can either say it as 3/10ths and 3/100ths, or I can say it as 33/100ths. Either way, it would fit into my decimal like this. Now, the percentage here is slightly different, because instead of just having 3 out of 100 as 3%, I've got 33 out of 100, which would be 33%. So now you might be able to see some links coming. Let's have a look at some common fraction decimals and percentages, which you might be familiar with. These are really great to just learn. If you don't already know these and can memorise them, they are really important to know. So see if you can follow the links. 1/2 is 0.5 or 50%. A quarter is 0.25 or 25%. And 3/4 is 0.75 or 75%. Like I said, these are facts you need to just learn and know off the top of your head if you don't already. So maybe you can see the link. 75% is 0.75. That would be 75/100ths. 25% is 0.25. That's 25/100ths. But what about 50%? I wonder if you could explain to me, or someone who you're with, why for 50% I've just got 0.5. 25% gave me 0.25, 75% gave me 0.75. So why is it that when my number here is 50%, I just have a 5, not a 0 as well? Well, the answer is to do with the place value. If I write in my tenths and my hundredths, I can see that I've actually got nothing in my hundredths, so I could put in a 0. That doesn't change the number at all. It's still 0.5, it still means the same, but I can see how my percentages link to my decimals, and that's quite useful to have a think about. So let's have a look at how I could go from a decimal to some fractions and percentages. If I had 0.27, then that would be 27 hundredths, or 27%. Maybe you could have a think about the next one before I tell you. If I had 0.89, what would that be out of 100? Hopefully you've got that it would be 89 out of 100, which would also be 89%. There are nice simple links here and patterns, and this is a perfect time to be following patterns. What about then if I started with 71%? What would that be? Well, if it's 71% out of 100, that's 71 parts out of 100, and I would write that as 0.71. Let's have a look though at an example like this. There's a difference here between these two. I wonder if you can work out what I'm going to say before I get any further. These two numbers look similar but are very different. If I was going to write 0.6 as a fraction, it would be 6 tenths, as we saw at the beginning. If I was writing 0.06 as a fraction, it would be 6 hundredths. These pieces for 6 hundredths are much smaller pieces than 6 tenths. So we know that if it's 6 hundredths, that is 6%. But what would 6 tenths be as a percentage? Can you work that out? I'll give you a clue. If I were to write it the same as this one, with the hundredths in, it would say 0.60. Hopefully, you've guessed it, it would be 60%. So you can imagine if you had phone battery of 60%, that would be much better than if it was just 6%. 60% is a lot more than just 6%. So although those decimals can look very similar, it's a common error for people to get mixed up and think that the 0 doesn't really make a difference, but it does. So that's something to bear in mind when you're doing questions like these. I'm just going to leave you with one final thing to think about, and I'm not going to answer it for you. If I gave you a fraction like this, which is actually what we call a mixed number, something like 1.5, what might that be as a decimal and as a percentage? The hint I'm going to give you is that it's important to remember that in an example like this, it's more than just one whole. Everything else we've looked at has been no wholes and just a part. This one, though, is more than one. See if you can work that out. See you later.